Hello creatures, welcome back to Bound by Words. My name is Maddie and today we're going to be talking about my two favorite writing books to date. These are the two that at any point in time right now, if you said, how do I learn writing as a craft? I would recommend one of these two books, and it's very likely that this video is going to become a series as I find new and exciting books that enhance my writing craft, but these are just two that I really love, and there are hundreds of writing books, if not thousands, and some of them are really famous. Either they're really popular or they're by really famous authors, and some of them you would never know existed if you didn't stumble across the right shelf in the bookstore. So the most important thing to remember when it comes to writing books is if it helps you, if you have learned something, if you are producing better work after reading it, then it is a good writing book. And before we start, the YouTube algorithm has told me now 70% of people who come and watch my videos are not subscribed. YouTube is straight up ratting you guys out. So if you have been here more than once and you enjoy my content, then please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you'll be notified when I post new videos. Alright, book number one. I know everyone's going to recognize it immediately. Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I feel like this has just popped up on YouTube and Instagram, left and right. Everyone has an obsession with this book and this way of planning and this sort of method in it. And I would actually recommend this book for other reasons. If you are just getting started with storytelling, or maybe you have any kind of problem with story structure, I would recommend this book on the basis that it is very clear. It is very concise. It uses modern language and modern examples, and it is very easy to read, all while describing the components that belong in a story and a rough order for them. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to plan and you have to use this book, because there are no have-tos in writing. Every writer and every manuscript is different, but I do think if you are learning about story structure, or maybe you have some hiccupy sections where you could really use some improvement, this book has a great way of just describing what each part of the story is and why. I personally am mostly a discovery writer. I have found that I write my best work whenever I am discovery writing or pantsing, although I do hate that word. And even though lately with projects, I have been trying to plot a little bit differently with each one to see if maybe I just haven't found my particular brand of plotting, I feel like I'm just a discovery writer at heart. I'm trying to get over it, but it seems like it might be impossible. But I learned so much in this book in regards to how to think about what is happening and why. Things like gripping hooks and dramatic climaxes get a lot of attention. Not only do people talk about them, but they're pretty easily recognizable. People don't want to read a book if they pick it up and it's boring in the beginning and the story has no peak. Nobody wants to read that book. But a lot of things that get neglected are how to build up the tension correctly to have that dramatic climax, or what do I do in the middle so that it's not sagging, or what should follow the inciting incident. And every type of plotting method has a slightly different explanation for a very similar thing. So between the beat sheet, the 3-act story structure, the 27 chapters, whatever you use, they are all describing the beginning of the story, the rise in conflict, the climax, and the resolution. I think that was probably backwards for you guys, but you get the idea. Every story has those parts. Every story moves in a similar way where we really have to learn and know more about the characters and get emotionally invested, and then we have that dark breaking point. I feel like no matter what plotting method you use, you have this book calls it the dark night of the soul, you have a reactionary period, your protagonist moment where they really just aren't sure if they're gonna win. Things like that are common between all plotting methods. And whenever I was studying story structure, I did a lot of research on the 3-act story structure, and that's what I planned my first book on. I did articles, and I listened to YouTube videos, and I took notes, and I read books, but everything was just a short tag. Something happens and your hero reacts. And people explain that, but it never really stuck with me as much as the descriptions in this book stuck with me. And after reading this book, it's a lot easier to say, oh yeah, this part right here, this is what it meant in the 3-act story structure whenever it said the hero has to react. And that's why this is a book I recommend, not because I think everyone needs to use the beat sheet, but because I think the way that they talk about stories here really made a lot of things about other plotting methods a lot more clear very quickly. But not only that, this book also uses really popular stories as reference. Me Before You, The Hunger Games, Ready Player One, because of Winn-Dixie, I think Pride and Prejudice is in here. The Fault in Our Stars, Twilight, like they just use examples. And in the first chunk of the book when they're explaining like why things are positioned in which way, they use very detailed examples like, you know, in this story when this happens, that's what we mean when we say the character's in a debate. And then they have chapters at the end which describe different types of stories, and each one covers one specific novel, and it breaks down exactly how each part of that novel fits into the beat sheet. And yes, it is an overall how to plan stories book, but honestly, it helped my creative mind sort of find a little bit of solidity. I've read through it twice now. It's just a really good reference book. It's especially good for when you're just really stuck on a part and you need a little bit of inspiration. It gives you examples of what other books did. Yes, but that was Save the Cat by Jessica Brody. Very popular book. If you haven't heard of it, I would be surprised. The next one I feel like is a little bit of a hidden gem. I never heard anyone talk about this. I found it on a recommendation. I don't even remember where the recommendation is, but I seen it once. Somebody somewhere on the internet was like, you should get this book and read it. This is what it was about. And I'm like, oh wow, yeah, that sounds like a really good book. And then I've never heard anyone mention it since then. And it is The First 5 Pages by Noah Lukeman. The cover's a little glossy, so it might be a little hard to see with my light on. But it is written by an editor. That's who Noah Lukeman is. And he talks about why editors reject your manuscript in the first 5 pages. So he gives a little bit of an insight into the publishing process and how people make decisions about whether they pursue a book or whether they reject it. He does mention in this that a lot of literary agents or publishers who accept or reject manuscripts read the first 5 pages and try to find something wrong with it so that they can reject it. And that sounds really harsh, but the first step is never, is this good, should I publish it? The first step is always, what's wrong with this? Is there anything wrong with this? And if the answer is yes, it gets rejected. And if the answer is no, then it moves on to the next stage where it's, is there anything more serious wrong with this? And if they still don't have anything, then it's like, okay, well, why should I want to pursue publishing it? And he goes through a little bit of that in this book. But this book is short and sweet. It was very fun to read, and it's sort of like a guide to writing craft. And even though it does include, like in the introduction and sprinkled throughout, how we want readers to keep our book in their hand, we want to get through the is there anything wrong with this book phase so that we can get people to the, well, why do I want to read this phase? So this book has 19 chapters and 3 sections. The 3 sections are preliminary problems, which talks about presentation, adjectives and adverbs, sound, comparison, and style. So the kind of things where you read it and you're immediately like, oh, do I want to keep going or am I good? And I think these are really important. I think not a lot of people pay a lot of attention, especially the adjectives and adverbs one. There's just some reading that you pick it up and you read it and you're like, why would you word it like that? It's so hard to read. And he covers things like that, and he gives examples of, this is hard to read, but if you changed it to this, it would be really simple and easy to read, which I really enjoyed. The second section is dialogue. And that also has 5 chapters, and it has a whole section. There's 3 sections in a book, and a whole section is on dialogue, and that should really emphasize how important it is. But it talks about being able to read between the lines, and dialogue that's too melodramatic, and dialogue that's hard to follow, like if there are too many dialogue tags or too few, or if they're weirdly placed, things like that. And the third section is called the bigger picture, where he talks about things like showing versus telling, and hooks and tone, and pacing versus progression, which I didn't really think were separate things until I read this book. And this also sort of reads like a manual. I would definitely recommend giving it a once through, reading it all the way. This is the book that changed reading for me. I feel like a lot of writers will understand this, but once you learn writing craft and once you learn how to tell stories better, it really messes with your ability to enjoy books. So I myself have read hundreds of books in my lifetime. I love reading. It's been a hobby since I was very young. And I have only had one book that entire time that I did not finish reading. And that was last summer. I read this book, and after I read this book, I picked up a small indie published book that had a really great premise, and I picked it up, and about 20 pages in, I was like, I really don't enjoy this. I don't know why these things are going on, and then I made myself read more of it because that's never happened before. I read stories and I enjoyed them whether they were good or bad. I had the ability to read a book and then when I was done, put it down and say, that had a weird ending or it wasn't really satisfying, and that didn't really bother me, but for some reason this one book bothered me and I never finished it. So I read this book towards the beginning of my writing journey and I learned how to identify problems by reading it, and I think that's what did it. I was able to pull out exactly what and why I didn't like this book, and that's what made me want to stop reading it. It's almost like if you meet somebody and they just rub you the wrong way and you can't tell why you don't like them, and then somebody's like, oh, well, they always words things so dramatically, and then you think about it for a minute and you're like, yeah, that's right. And then every time you see that person, you're like, oh my gosh, they're just being so dramatic, and it gets under your skin and you can't forget it or unhear it. This book did that for me for reading. So I was reading this novel and I was on vacation, and I realized it had a lot of telling and almost no showing. And I realized it had an incredible amount of info dumping, and that the dialogue was both flat and rigid. And 100 pages almost into this book, I think I made it 80 pages before I actually said, okay, I don't have to read any more of this. But I would read and it would be like 2 paragraphs of story, or 2D ultra scripted dialogue would take place. So like character 1 would say something, character 2 would say something, character 3 would say something, and then character 1 would say something again. It was dialogue like that the whole time, but it was only like 2 paragraphs of story, and then it was 3 pages of info dumping. 3 pages of, this person is my best friend, and this is our childhood, and this is why you should care. And I just cared less and less the more it happened. And being able to point out things like that and saying, this is exactly what I don't like about the book, made it so that every time I encountered an instance of something I had seen before, it like added to my frustration of it. That's one of the reasons this is my most recommended book, actually. I would probably tell people to pick this up way before Save the Cat, because it was so life-changing for me. And I think if you're a writer, you should, if not give this book a chance, give a book like this a chance, where it teaches you how to dissect writing and identify problems. And when he goes through and points out a problem, he gives you like a paragraph of an example of, here's the problem, and a paragraph of the same example but corrected, and you can see the difference. And some of them are like, well, duh, that's really obvious, like you really shouldn't do that in writing because it sounds so fake. And other ones, it's like, I didn't really ever think about that. And I feel like everyone's duh, that's common sense things are probably slightly different. There are probably things that I read in this book that I said, well, of course, who would do that other people had not thought of. And there are definitely things in this book that other people probably thought, well, why would you even do that? And I thought, well, I didn't even think to check, honestly. And one of the reasons this is called the first 5 pages is because at the end of each chapter, there are exercises to do, and usually they involve the first 5 pages of your manuscript or less. So it's sort of written like you have a complete manuscript, now let's make it pretty kind of book. But I got a lot of value out of reading this before I had started writing, because then I knew what I was looking out for. And I keep it at my desk. I actually keep it up here in my floating shelf as a reference book, so that if I ever need it, I could just pull it down so I can check my dialogue examples, or I can check and see if my adjectives are too flowery. On top of that, I bought this book on Amazon for like $9 or even less. I have gotten more than its value out of this book, and I just am a little bit hurt that nobody talks about it. It's such a great book. So if you have any books that you really enjoyed reading that really helped your writing, please leave it in the comments below. I'm always looking for new recommendations. So if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. I post writing related content every Monday.